Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for being with us today in this new edition of Community Chats from Montefiore Nyack Hospital. This is Sandra Arevalo, Director of Community Health and Wellness. And as you already might know, our goal with these community chats is to bring information, good information, expert information to our community. So thank you so much for joining us. If you're not watching this live, if you're watching the recording, thank you so much for doing that. Don't forget to tell your friends, families, neighbors, and the whole community, about this information if you find it useful. Today, we're going to be talking about vaccines, and we have an expert here, Deirdre Minahan. It's actually a clinical pharmacist specialist in infectious diseases. I had to read that because that was a mouthful. But obviously, she is the expert who can tell us if vaccines are really necessary, to prevent infectious diseases, which is supposed to be the goal. I know that a lot of people are a little resistant to get vaccines, and today we're going to find out if resistance is actually a good thing or not. So without further ado, Deirdre, she is one of our pharmacists here at Montefiore Nyack, but I'm sure that you have a little bit more to tell us about your role here in the hospital before we get into the subject. And for all of those who are joining us live, please participate, use the chat, the Q&A, send us comments, concerns, questions. We're happy to answer those. This is your space, and that's the best use of this space. So please don't hesitate. Deirdre, thank you so much for being here, for doing this presentation, for your time prepping and spending on this, and now for being with us today. How are you?
I'm doing very well, Sandra. Thanks so much for the opportunity today, and thanks really for the fine introduction that you gave just a moment ago. And yes, I'm happy to be here today. I'm a clinical pharmacy specialist for infectious diseases at Nyack Montefiore Hospital, and my day-to-day activities include patient monitoring, patients that are on antibiotics, and making vaccine recommendations when needed. So I'm hoping that this presentation will give you a little bit more information on making a well-informed decision on whether you want to vaccinate or whether you do not want to vaccinate. My goal here is to give you information so you can make the best decision for yourself.
And you know what? I'm loving this already because you're saying when you need to vaccinate. So we are already with that expression, we already know that we don't need to be using vaccines all the time. It's only in certain times. But I let you get into the presentation, and then I'm sure we're gonna have a conversation. So go ahead. We're all looking at your screen. It looks great.
Sure, thank you. Okay, so many people may be hesitated or have feelings of hesitation in regarding to getting vaccinated or not. So in this presentation, we're going to discuss the facts about vaccines, mainly how do vaccines work, where do vaccines come from, vaccine efficacy, and vaccine side effects. Sometimes I'll refer to side effects as adverse reactions, and then sometimes I will refer to words such as viruses or pathogens or antigens. And when I use the virus or antigen or pathogen term, they're interchangeable. So they all mean the same thing in regards to this particular presentation. So before we talk about vaccines, it's important to understand some immunization basic terminology. When we have an infection within our body has white blood cells, and our white blood cells come from our bone marrow, and our bone marrow is located in our bone. So what happens is these white blood cells, they can make various different kinds of white blood cells, and one of those white blood cells comes from something called a B lymphocyte, and a B lymphocyte makes antibodies. So antibodies really what they are important cells within your body that will help fight an infection after it is that it's exposed first. Your body's exposed to an infection, and then the white blood cell will make an antibody. And then what happens is, if you're re-exposed to the same virus, your body has a memory and it will pump out the antibodies to that prior infection. And those antibodies will act as an army to take down the virus or a bacteria that's invading your body. These are some basic terminologies to understand for the presentation. So what is immunity? So we all have an immune system, and our immune system starts basically at our skin. That's the first layer of immunity right there. It protects pathogens or viruses from entering the body. However, we do have our eyes and our nose and our mouth that can actually act as an entryway for a virus. So when we have immunity, we have a record of all the different viruses and bacteria that we've been exposed to. So when we encounter those again, our body remembers and recalls the infection from before. And what it does is it responds in a way to help fight the new infection so that people don't have severe consequences from the infection. So a vaccine, what it does is it mimics this in a way that what it does, it's a preparation that's used to stimulate the body's own immune response against diseases. So a person will be vaccinated, and what will happen is there'll be an immune response where your body will make antibodies, and then those antibodies will be stored in your body. And then when the real virus is encountered, the antibodies will be called out to action, and they will bind to the actual invader, pathogen, virus, whatever, and take it down. So vaccines come in a variety of different modalities. They can be injected with needles. Some can be administered orally, and then some can also be sprayed as an intranasal spray or sprayed right into the nose. And then vaccination just means it's the act of introducing a vaccine into the body to produce a protection from a specific disease. And then immunization is the process by which a person becomes protected against the disease through vaccination. And again, there's many interchangeable terms within this presentation, but you can use the terminology vaccination or inoculation. They mean the same thing as immunization. So you may be wondering, how do these vaccines work? And I'm going to get into that in the next illustration. So basically what happens is vaccines, what they do is they take an inactivated form of a pathogen or a virus or an antigen, and we'll be talking about how this is done further down the line, or just even a small bit of the virus itself, like a component of it. And then what happens is when our immune system is exposed to this part of pathogen that could be inactivated, weakened, our immune responds sufficiently by creating specific antibodies to the invader that will bind to it. And then what happens is the antibodies, once they bind to the virus and get rid of the virus, their job isn't done there. They actually go back into your body in storage for future encounters with a virus that's similar or the same, and they're ready to come out and fight again if they are presented with the same virus. This slide, what it shows is just common vaccines and what they prevent. So diseases such as mumps, polio, tetanus, whooping cough, and measles were commonly seen years back. Now, while we do see a little bit of measles coming back and even polio, we don't see many mumps, tetanus, or whooping cough. Now, polio and measles seem to have been coming back because there has been some resistance in using vaccines. And when vaccines aren't used, many vaccine preventable diseases can come back and become endemic. So there's a real fear in that because measles, it can cause blindness. It can also cause hearing loss. And it's just something that we have the tools to prevent. And it's basically in our benefit to prevent a disease such as measles. Vaccines, they prevent 2 to 3 million deaths every year worldwide, according to the World Health Organization. And again, measles is one of the world's most contagious diseases. It's airborne. So approximately 90% of people who are unprotected and in close case with a measles case will contract measles. So this is something just to be aware of, that while we have a vaccine that prevents measles, we do have some cases that have been cropping up because there has been some vaccine hesitancy. You may be asking yourself, where do vaccines come from? And in order to understand where vaccines come from, we need to understand the vaccine life cycle, which is a slide that I will show next slide. So this is a representation of the vaccine life cycle. And there's many different phases to getting a vaccine discovered, researched, and approved for use by into the public arena. So the first stage in the orange is basic research. So it's scientists, they're looking at many different antigens and pathogens and trying to see what are some targets that can be used to fight against them. And then after that, there's preclinical studies. So this is where it's a very research intensive type of stage. And the focus is finding foreign substances that induce an immune reaction within your body that would trigger a same reaction as an actual virus or bacteria would. And identifying the right antigen or antigens can take up to 4 years. So it is pretty labor intensive, this part. Phases 1 phases 1 deals with safety. So safety testing is basically where you get volunteers. It could be 60 to 100 volunteers, and they volunteer to have a vaccine, and then safety data is collected. In phase 2, effectiveness is tested, and this involves a greater number of volunteers, and this is where they want to see, does a vaccine work? So the first stage, safety, is you're just collecting data to see, is the vaccine safe? The second part is where you're actually testing to see, does the vaccine work? And it involves more volunteers. And then it extends out to phase 3, which involves a greater number of people, often thousands of people. And this is a stage where safety and effectiveness are both assessed. And this can take a long time because there's a lot of data and different protocols that are followed for a good clinical trial before a vaccine is approved for use by the FDA. So again, like after going through all the different phases, the FDA, the Food Drug Administration, will review the safety data, the efficacy data, and they will approve the vaccine or not approve it. It depends on really what type of data comes out of the phase 1, 2, and 3 trial information. And once a vaccine is approved for by the FDA, it actually continues on for more monitoring. And this is in the post-marketing phase. So once a vaccine comes to market and it's used in the public, there is data that continues to be collected to make sure that safety is maintained and that there aren't any serious unexpected adverse events that you may not see in a smaller population, but you may see in a larger population because you're giving the vaccine to a larger amount of people. And then an important piece of this puzzle too is the ACIP, which is the Advisory Committee of Immunization Practices. So after FDA reviews the vaccine and approves it for use, it doesn't go straight into the public for use. There's another regulatory body called the Advisory Committee of Immunization Practices, and they will review the information and they will make a recommendation on whether or not the vaccine should be used, who it should be used in, how often it should be used, so on and so forth. So this is a really rigorous vetting process, and it can take from start to finish up to 15 years. This is an illustration of the 4 different ways of how to make a vaccine. So there's 4 different types of vaccines that we use, and one of them is an inactivated vaccine. And in the next slides, I'll give you examples of the different types of vaccines I'm discussing here. But with inactivated vaccines, an inactivated vaccine is basically it's a killed part of the virus, and the killed part of the virus is no longer alive, so it's not viable. It's only a killed virus, and it's being used as a vaccine to induce an immune response in your body when it is given as a vaccination. The second type of vaccines are attenuated vaccines, and these are weakened viruses that are used to trigger immune response. So they're not killed, but they're not viable enough to cause human infection. They're just viable enough to induce an immune response within your body, and that's what you want. You want your body to respond and make antibodies to a virus or a pathogen. And then there's subunit vaccines. So subunit vaccines are only little bits of the virus that teach your immune system to recognize the whole virus. So the whole virus will cause the disease, the illness, but little pieces of the virus known as a subunit vaccine, they will not cause disease. It will just cause an immune response in your body and the creation of antibodies to fight the whole virus. And then the 4th and final one are nucleic acid vaccines. So these types of vaccines, they use virus DNA or RNA and to enable human cells to make portions of the virus itself, not the whole virus, but portions that will induce an immune response. And this is also antibody generating as well. So going over some vaccine types, and you'll see in the column, there's live attenuated, inactivated, toxoid, subunit, and nucleic acid vaccines. So live attenuated vaccines, again, it's a weakened live pathogen, and examples of a type of vaccine using a live attenuated version would be the measles, mumps, and rubella vaccine, MMR you'll hear. And then there's also the varicella vaccine, which is a vaccine to prevent chickenpox. Inactivated vaccines are, again, they're dead or inactivated pathogen, and examples of these vaccine types include the seasonal influenza virus that we have a recommendation to have once a year if you're an adult. And then for pediatric patients, the recommendation is to have at least 2. And then there's the hepatitis A vaccine, and hepatitis A is a illness that can cause, it's foodborne illness, and it can cause GI disturbances and liver issues. A toxoid now is different from a virus. A toxoid comes from a bacteria, and what it is, its toxin is made from the bacteria, and a toxoid can be inactivated, or the toxin is inactivated and turned into a toxoid, and the toxoid is injected as a vaccine. And an example of a toxoid vaccination would be diphtheria, pertussis, and tetanus. So the children will get what's called a DTaP vaccine, and then adults will get the Tdap. And this it's recommended for adults to get a Tdap booster every 10 years to prevent tetanus, for example, and the other diseases that you see along with it, with diphtheria and pertussis. An example of a subunit vaccine is hepatitis B. And again, subunit vaccines just use a part of the pathogen or the antigen, just a little piece of it, not the whole piece. And then nucleic acid vaccines, an example would be the COVID-19 vaccine. And basically what this is, a type of COVID vaccine is mRNA vaccine. And the vaccine, when it's injected, it goes into your body and it causes these cells called dendritic cells that are antigen presenting cells to produce pieces of the SARS-CoV-2 virus. And then what happens is your body is trained to recognize the SARS-CoV-2 virus that comes from the vaccine. It's not a whole virus, just pieces of it. And then your body makes appropriate antibodies to fight the virus when you're exposed to it. So the next thing I thought we could talk about would be vaccine efficacy. And this slide, what it shows is just dramatic declines in vaccine preventable diseases when compared to the pre-vaccine era. So vaccines were, in the 15th century, people were trying to make themselves immune to smallpox. And what they would do is they would expose themselves to the disease itself in hopes that it would be a weaker infection and their body would remember it. And that if they encountered that infection again, they would not have a severe illness. And then the next, about in the late 1700s, Edward Jenner, he was a scientist. What he did was he looked at injecting cowpox into volunteers and seeing if the injectable cowpox virus would decrease smallpox. So cowpox is different than smallpox. But what he did find is that when he injected or vaccinated people with the cowpox vaccine, they were able to avoid getting smallpox. So that was really the first major vaccine on the scene. And then a scientist with the last name of Pasteur, he created the rabies vaccine a few years later. So vaccines have been around a pretty long time. And you can see with the diseases pre-vaccination era, they had a lot of annual morbidity. Morbidity means sickness, doesn't mean death, but it just means like sickness and infirmity or just not feeling like yourself. And if you look to the right of the table, you can see that the percent decreases in these diseases, really, there was a huge dramatic decline once vaccines were introduced. And there's a whole host of diseases that we see that none of us would want to experience, ranging all the way from hepatitis to meningitis to polio, smallpox, and tetanus. So side effects, a lot of people, when they think about getting a vaccination, they are thinking about protecting themselves, but they worry about side effects. And that's understandable because it's scary getting a needle. I remember as a child myself, I used to dread going for my annual pediatrician checkup because I was concerned, was I going to get a needle? Over the years, I've gotten used to it. So it's something that is not concerning as it was, but I certainly appreciate the fears and anxieties people may have when it comes to getting vaccinated and encountering side effects. So side effects and risks, sometimes you'll hear them referred to as adverse reactions. Most vaccine side effects, they're mild. And these mild reactions can involve muscle arm soreness, redness around the vaccination site, some fever, feeling fatigue or tired, headache. And this is what we mostly see with vaccinations. And one of the things that I've heard over the years, going to continuing education classes for immunizations, is that you can decrease the amount of soreness in your arm after vaccination. The one way to do it is to move your arm around quite a bit. So lots of times vaccines are given within the upper region of the shoulder area. So the idea is if you move your arm around as much as you can after having a vaccine, that's supposed to decrease discomfort. And I have tried that myself, and I think it works. Yeah, of course, we have to discuss the potential for severe reactions, and severe reactions do occur. Thankfully, fortunately, they're not common like a mild reaction. They're rare, and sometimes they can involve allergic reactions. And as we saw with the COVID vaccines in male patients, in young male patients, there were increases in myocarditis. But the thing to think about is the risk versus benefit, right? So myocarditis was seen in the vaccines with for COVID, but we also can see myocarditis from COVID disease itself. And when you have COVID disease and you get myocarditis, it's much much more common than getting myocarditis from a COVID vaccine. Some people, after they get a vaccine, they'll have a unrelated health problem that comes up. And this unrelated health problem would have happened even if they didn't get the vaccine. But because they get the vaccine and then in time relationship close to the vaccine, they get a health problem, they think in their mind that the unrelated health problem is due to the vaccine when it's not. So that's something to keep in mind, is that sometimes health problems occur without getting a vaccine, but if you have a vaccine in relation to the health problem cropping up, one can think, oh, that this happened because of the vaccine, when in reality it didn't. And I should mention is that all adverse events from vaccines are reportable nationally, so that we have a national reporting system called Vaccine Adverse Event Reporting System, VAERS, and it's a early warning system that monitors the safety of vaccines after they're authorized or licensed by the U.S. Food and Drug Administration. So VAERS is a database that anyone can access on the internet. They can type in VAERS and they can put in their event of a adverse reaction or side effect that they feel should be reported as an adverse event. And again, VAERS is available to everyone, and this data is looked at and it's used for ongoing safety monitoring purposes. So when people get vaccinated, they may hear in the media some common vaccine safety myths that I'll give a brief overview of. And sometimes these vaccine safety myths may include, oh, you know what, I'm just getting too many vaccines too soon, and my immune system is going to be overwhelmed. It's just too much for my immune system to handle. But if you have a good immune system and you're not immunocompromised, we're exposed to many different bacteria and viruses every day when we go outside and every day when we eat. So our bodies know how to handle a lot of different immune components. But I just want to make mention that when the first vaccine was created, it was the smallpox vaccine, and it had over 200 immunological proteins within it itself. Like one single smallpox vaccine had over 200 immunological proteins. But the vaccines that we have available today, and they mentioned 14 here, they actually contain less of these immunological proteins combined. So if you took the 14 vaccines together, they have 160 immunological proteins combined total, compared to the smallpox vaccine that used to have over 200. And again, this kind of rivals, too many vaccines can overwhelm the immune system. And again, there's a lot of data research out there that shows that increases in the number of vaccines, they don't have any effect on the immune function. Another popular safety myth is that the MMR vaccine causes autism. And there was an original study that people can search out, and it was in 1998 in JAMA. And the study looked at 12 children that had autism within a short time of receiving a vaccine for MMR. But what happened is that a lot of the trial, there was a small number of children, and then some of the evidence was actually misrepresented data. And because of this, the paper was retracted, meaning that once it was published, it was taken out of publication because the people reviewing the publication, the peer-reviewed publication process, realized that the data was misrepresented and that it wasn't a true representation of the data that was coming out of the study. And multiple large-scale studies since then have shown that receipt of the MMR and the risk of autism are not associated. Another myth is the HPV vaccine increases the risk of autoimmune disease. So HPV vaccine, it protects against cervical cancer. And there has been, if you look out on the internet, there is some, I guess, some sites that claim that the HPV vaccine causes a risk of autoimmune disease. What's interesting is that HPV itself can cause, increased risk in some autoimmune diseases, but the vaccine itself doesn't. And there's been, repeated well-designed studies show no association between HPV and autoimmune diseases. Another myth is that if you give the flu vaccine too early in a pregnancy, that it increases the risk of miscarriage. But again, there was a study of over 2,700 women, and in the study showed that there wasn't any association between the flu vaccine and miscarriage. This slide just basically sums up some of the information that I've spoken about today. On the left, you can see that, vaccines are safe. So there's many different phases of study that gets a vaccine from the preclinical phase all the way over to the approval process with the FDA, reviewed by the Advisory Committee of Immunization Practices, to post-marketing surveillance for continued safety and monitoring purposes. We also have 4 different clinical surveillance systems to oversee and monitor vaccine efficacy and safety in the United States. And one of them I spoke about was VAERS. And it's anyone can enter a VAERS report if they feel that an adverse event or side effect is due to a vaccine that they've received. And there's, again, like many different phases of clinical trials that assess safety, efficacy, and for people receiving vaccines. And billions of vaccines have been administered in the United States for over 50 years. And serious adverse events, while they occur, they are rare. So you always have to think about the risk versus the benefit. Is the risk of getting an adverse effect, is it worse than the actual getting the disease and getting long-term sequelae from the disease itself? For example, some patients get sick after having a disease itself, like measles. They can lose their eyesight or their hearing. So you have to balance the side effects of the vaccine versus the adverse effects of the actual disease itself before deciding whether or not to get vaccinated. And this timeline on the right, it just shows a little bit of vaccine development. So you can see in 1798, that's when Edward Jenner started working on a smallpox vaccine. And then about 100 years later, Louis Pasteur developed a rabies vaccine. And then in 1918, there was this flu pandemic where it killed 25 to 50 million worldwide. And then about 35 years later or so, or 25 years later, a flu vaccine was introduced to the United States. And then polio came on the scene in 1952, and 3 years later, the first polio vaccine pioneered by Jonas Salk was introduced and licensed in the USA. And I remember having a conversation with one of my neighbors, and she's 77 today, and she talked about when she was a school-age child, she remembers hearing all the news about how polio was affecting people that she even knew. And when her mom heard there was a vaccine out for polio, she took her to the school gymnasium, because at the time they were doing mass vaccination efforts against polio, and my neighbor got vaccinated, and her mom was relieved, because seeing a child having to live in an iron lung was something that they feared back then when we didn't have vaccination against polio. And then measles was developed in 1963. And then in 1980, smallpox was the first infectious disease that was eradicated by vaccination. So that was a wonderful thing to have in this timeline. And then you can see various vaccines for the pneumococcal disease that causes pneumonia in patients. Not the vaccine, but the pneumococcal virus, or pneumococcal bacteria rather, causes severe pneumonias. And then there's the HPV vaccine that was licensed to prevent cervical cancer. And then every year we have new flu vaccines and new COVID vaccines being developed depending on the strains that are circulating. So the important message is really, educate yourself, find out facts for yourself without, getting overwhelmed in terms of hearing about all the adverse effects. You want to also think about the adverse effects of the disease itself. Learn about the diseases and, what happens when you get the disease, not just having the disease itself, but the effects that come after having the disease itself, and how they can be prevented many times because there are available vaccines to prevent getting the disease in the first place. And by getting vaccines, not only do we protect ourselves, but we also protect members within our community. And that's something that's important, is thinking not just of ourselves, but our entire community. And again, vaccines can save over 2 to 3 million lives per year worldwide. So it's a thing that is something to keep in mind when making a decision on whether or not to become vaccinated. And here are just some resources that I've provided, some websites. So if you're having difficulty finding out where to get a vaccine, if you visit these websites, https /www.nc.cdc.gov or /travel/page/find clinic, you can find an area where you can get a vaccine using your zip code. And then there's also a vaccines.gov website. This is very helpful if you're traveling abroad and you want to find out if you need to get a vaccine to prevent against a vaccine preventable disease abroad. Like one of those that I helped a patient with lately is for yellow fever, and someone was looking for a vaccine in the area where they could get vaccinated against yellow fever before traveling abroad. And we visited the site together, and we were able to locate a provider that would have that vaccine. So just to wrap up, vaccines are safe and they're effective in preventing disease. And the biggest thing is educating yourself and really weighing risk versus benefit, and making decisions on whether or not you want to get vaccinated or not. And these are resources and further reading that I find helpful. Immunize.org, and also cdc.gov and the WHO website, the World Health Organization website, and the NFID website.
Very interesting. Thank you for making that review. And I love to hear the history of how, you know, some of the scientists came to discover the vaccines. I think that's beautiful. You know, that's wonderful. It's definitely literally life-changing. So thank you for making that review. We have a few questions. One of them is really good. Why did the development of the COVID vaccine not take as long as with other vaccines?
Okay, it's a really great question. So from my reading, the scientists that came up with the mRNA technology for vaccination, that actually was being developed in 1990. So if you research as far back in 1990, that's over 30 years ago now. So there was research going on in 1990, and there's two scientists that won the Nobel Peace Prize for it. And I actually, I'm forgetting his last name, but it's Dr. Drew. But I remember when I was making a decision for myself back in 2020 whether or not to get vaccinated, because it's scary, you know, it's a new technology. I did my own research. I saw that this type of this research on mRNA vaccines had been started in 1990, and I found the scientist's name. And I found out where he worked, and I emailed him. I wasn't expecting an email back, but wow. I wanted to know, and I asked some questions, and I have that email saved in my email somewhere for his answer. So anytime I get a feeling of, should I get vaccinated or not, I pull that piece of paper out to remind me that this technology has been around since 1990. And what happened is, you know, if you look at polio, right? Polio had to be rolled out pretty fast as well. But if you do your research and you look for the name of the scientist, and he's at University of Pennsylvania, and I'm sorry, I can't remember his last name, but his first name is Drew. He has been involved in that research since 1990. And when he responded to my email, I was so surprised, but he talked over my concerns and my fears. And this is back in December of 2020. Because you know, as healthcare workers, we were first in line to get this vaccine. And
We all felt like the guinea pigs, right?
Yeah, and I signed up for my vaccine appointment. I remember on December 18th, 2020, but about 2 weeks before that, I was doing a lot of reading. I was nervous, and I reached out to the scientists, and I wanted to know, how long has this technology been around, you know, and he addressed it all. And then I started going into doing my own research. There's a search engine, a scientific search engine, it's PubMed. And I'm that type of person where I do my own footwork before making a decision. So I looked into PubMed, and I searched out all the papers that were going over this technology, and I saw it. Wow, this technology has been around since 1990, and it's just they're having to pull it up to view now because of this, you know, global situation that affected so many of our lives and still affecting us today, right? So it was a quick rollout in terms of, you know, having to do it because the graveness of the situation at hand at the time. But if you do your own research, you will see that this mRNA vaccine technology dates back to 1990. So I felt very And when I saw that, I was like, okay, it's not just rolled out in 2 years or whatever.
So can we say
Yeah.
that it wasn't accelerated, but rather was good timing?
Accelerated because they had to, so I think what it is that when vaccines go through trials, right? We saw in the timeline that there's preclinical studies, phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, FDA approval, and that timeline can be 15 years. So when you're trying to get all your data in a certain compressed amount of time, because the graveness of a certain situation, it doesn't mean that those I's haven't been dotted or those T's, lined or whatever. It's just that the work to move forward, it was present to move forward, but there wasn't a situation to be like, oh, we need to move forward with this now because, there wasn't anything like COVID beforehand. And COVID has so many different, variants, and it's changes all the time. You really need to come up with a vaccine that will be able to be made quickly. mRNA technology is made quick to respond to the ever-changing variants. We have strains of flu that change, but they don't have that rapid change as COVID has demonstrated. Variants will continue to develop, and there are projects that are looking at a more durable response, meaning that you'll be able to get a vaccine and the vaccine will last longer, because now when you get a vaccine for COVID, there's the situation of waning immunity, and waning immunity means that your body still has the measures to fight the infection, but because there's changing variants, the variants change and that they don't match the antibodies that you created before. So you have to be exposed to new and then make new antibodies to be able to fight the new variants. So that's what waning immunity is.
Yeah. And I think we have time for one more question. Can we completely start getting rid of certain diseases like polio, for example, maybe eventually COVID, just by vaccinating people? Is there a way how we can start extinguishing certain diseases?
Yeah, I definitely feel that with polio, we can, polio, unfortunately, because people are hesitant to get vaccinated, there's been some polio cases, right? But back in the 1950s, we saw that when the oral polio vaccine was introduced, now we have something called inactivated polio vaccine, which is not the oral one. But when that was introduced, we saw that endemic cases really decrease. We didn't have them on the scene, right? But when you don't vaccinate, you're going to get an uptick because you can't eradicate it if not everybody's getting vaccinated. And the same thing with COVID. If everybody's not getting vaccinated and then there's different variants on the scene, from my standpoint, COVID's always going to be around. It's not going to be just like be eradicated. It's a virus, and viruses are smart. Viruses are always looking for ways to take advantage of our bodies so they can use our bodies to pump out their information, because viruses don't have the machinery that we do to make their own protein. So they have to invade our bodies and hijack our protein making cells in order to survive, right? So they're very smart, and the best way we can do for now is to protect ourselves and get vaccinated. And there is a new vaccine coming out for COVID in the fall. And some people may be wondering, should they get vaccinated right now? And I wouldn't recommend, I'm not going to say that this is everyone's recommendation. This is what I would do for myself. I've been a year out from a COVID vaccine, so I would wait for me to get the new one that's coming up in September, because the new one is updated and the previous one, while it's available, you know, I had COVID last year, so it matched the strain that I was vaccinated with, but that's why I want to wait to get the new one, and it's coming very soon, you know, so that's why I'm gonna wait, because I would much prefer, and when I think about the side effects that I had with the COVID vaccine, like I had some arm pain, some fatigue and tiredness, and you know, when I had COVID itself, I felt worse than the vaccine, and I got COVID for the first time last year in August of 2023, and I had never had it before, and you know, I had my vaccine series and a vaccine about 10 months before that. So yeah, I'm looking at getting the new vaccine when it's available, because I don't like COVID. I didn't feel good at all.
I don't think anybody likes COVID, flu, or any of those diseases.
Yeah.
So thank you so much.
You're very welcome.
For, you know, showing us the science behind these. I think that once we understand the science, it's easier for us to understand that it's good to get all of our vaccines, and of course, make sure our loved ones get theirs as well. And for our participants today, thank you so much for being with us. Thank you for sharing this time. Next week, or next month, rather, I want to say, is Breastfeeding Month. It's also Alcohol Dependence and Other Substances Month. So we're going to have a lot of topics related to that. And as a matter of fact, on August 1st, we're going to have what everyone should know about lactation and breastfeeding. So we're going to talk about those myths and truths about breastfeeding. So if you're a young mother, or you know any young mothers, or would like to learn information that you can share with them, you know, join us at 12 next week. And we're going to have an extra next month on Wednesday evening in collaboration with the Finkelstein Memorial Library in Spring Valley and Nyack Library in Nyack, of course. We're going to have another talk about immunization. So don't miss that one. The title is Rockland Department of Health Response. So we're going to learn about what the Rockland Department of Health is doing to keep us all healthy and vaccinated. So please keep us company, and I will see you next week. Deirdre, thank you so much for being with us today. Your presentation was really excellent. And
thank you so much
for all of you over there for joining us. I'll see you next week. Bye-bye.